all of that kind of stuff. And the exhibit was in the Cherokee Nation National Museum from September of 2022 all the way up until June of 2023. And so if you didn't get a chance to go and see it, it just has been placed at the University of Tulsa's Oklahoma Center for the Humanities. And it's going to be there until I think was they said 2 months. So it's going to be there until October. So the address is at 101 East Archer. And they tried to put as much of the full exhibit because it took up the entire floor of the Cherokee Nation National Museum. But you'll see photos. If they retain, I'm pretty sure they retained a photo of my great grandfather. His picture, great great grandfather too. His photo and his story is in there. And then there's a quote that they put up on the wall. And if you know anything about freedmen, Cherokee freedmen in particular, you know that it was a very big deal for this exhibit to even take place. The fact that this was even commissioned, the fact that they went and got the stories, and not only that, but they're continuing to share the photos and the stories on social media. It gets the most traction on their page, you all. And I only know this because I talk to the people who are putting this stuff up and they're telling me this. So if you have a chance to go to Tulsa in the next couple months to go and check out the exhibit, please make sure that you do. We would love your support in that. All right, I am gonna go ahead and get started because we have a whole bunch to talk about today. All right, make sure this is in the window. Okay. All right. And before we jump in a lot, well, actually, there's a comment in the chat. I want to make sure I recognize you guys that are here. Yes, there's a comment from Annalise. She says there was a long fight to get recognition for the Freedmen. I think some of you have seen the film By Blood. I'm so glad that Tracy shared it, and that there was a screening of that prior to our session today, because I think it gives the proper context to what the struggle has been like for those of us that have ancestry within the Cherokee Nation. It's for me, it's something that I did not. I grew up knowing that we were connected to the Cherokee Nation, but I didn't grow up knowing that, like, the actual story. And I think everyone, I think I can go out on a limb and say this, that many people who are living in the United States, I would say most of the folks, they have the story that they are Cherokee or that they're Native American. And if they are Native American, they're almost always Cherokee. So it wasn't out of the ordinary. It was just the, again, the connection, the direct connection to it, and the just the way that it shook out. It took me some time to process that once I did. Once I learned the way that my family showed up in the nation, oh, you couldn't stop me at that point. Still haven't. So feel free, those of you who are here virtually, those of you who are in the room, ask questions whenever they come up. There's going to be a ton of information I'm going to share with you guys today. It's going to feel like it's a lot. There is a handout for this, so don't feel like you have to take copious notes and like, oh my gosh, like I needed to go back to that. There's a handout for this, so I can make sure that you all get it as well. One of the other things that I also want to share is the photos that are a part of this presentation are all pictures of my family that are connected to the Cherokee Nation. This photo that you're looking at now is a photo of my great-great-grandmother. Her name was Sarah Jane Ryder Bean Starr. She was married a few times. Oh, I forgot the Allen. That was another name that she had. And my great grandmother, who's named Clara Allen Rogers, she's sitting on her lap. And then there's Uncle Claude Allen, who is there as well. And the reason why I start this presentation with a photo of them is because all three of them were rejected by the Dawes Commission. And right now, for some of you, that might not have any value in that statement. But once you get through hearing about what we're going to talk about today, you'll understand why me saying that is so important. A lot of times when folks start this research, they feel like if their ancestor got rejected by the Dawes Commission, that there's no value in that, that there's nothing that you can glean, that all hope is lost, there is no story. When in reality, if your ancestor did not get approved by the Dawes Commission, you actually have much more paper and documentation on your ancestors than I would say 80 to 90% of Black people in the United States for that time period in that era. Another thing I will tell you is that freedmen of the five tribes, which are the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskogee Creek, and Seminole Nations, are the most documented group of Black people in the United States. Of course, this is due to my double-blind study and empirical research. I'm kidding. But because I do research all over the United States and the Caribbean, and I've done research in other countries, what I can tell you is that Black folks in the Indian Territory, specifically freedmen, and I'm not talking about folks that are from Black towns, because we know the largest number of Black towns in the US was in Oklahoma. Many of those Black towns were freedmen of the five tribes established those towns. But with freedmen of the five tribes, in particular Cherokee, um, you get way more first person accounts where you get to hear from your ancestors as opposed to folks writing down what they thought or what they were told about them. And we are constantly yearning for the voice, to hear the voice of our ancestors. So again, you'll see why I'll prove my point to you about us being the most documented group of Black folks. All right, now couched in this conversation about genealogy and family history for freedmen is a conversation around Emancipation Day. And we're commemorating, or we're having this session around the time of Emancipation Day in the Cherokee Nation. And, you know, especially since the federal passage of the Juneteenth holiday, people around the country and even potentially the world are connecting the whole celebration of our freedom and freedom from the bondage of slavery to June 15th, which is connected to the day that that General Gordon Granger went into Galveston, Texas, and read the general order, and that's now become a national holiday. Well, the thing about it is, freedom was celebrated on different days in different parts of the country. And I don't want to offend any of the Texas people in here or Texas adjacent folks. And technically, we are Texas adjacent in Oklahoma. But Emancipation Day in the Cherokee Nation and in the Indian Territory was celebrated on August 1st. It was not celebrated on June 15th. And in other places, it was celebrated on January 1st. Why January 1st? Because that is the day of the Emancipation Proclamation. And then when you start rolling back, and when it went into effect, and then when you start rolling it back, you realize that the Emancipation Proclamation is tied to the Confiscation Act and to the Militia Act, so that Black men can be enlisted into the United States Armed Forces. Because before they couldn't be recruited and they couldn't be enlisted. So all Abraham Lincoln was doing was co-signing the Militia Act and the Confiscation Acts. That's literally all he was doing. He was repeating it. It was like, I don't know, when you have to get up and give your Easter speech and you gotta recite the same thing over and over again so it sticks. So this is an example of newspaper coverage. That's another thing in this area that we have a ton of. Note it says that Gooseneck Bend Emancipation Day to be celebrated this year. It will begin August 1st. A good program is prepared for the 4 days of celebration. You see how they did 4 days. This was back in 1904. This was in the newspaper. Yes, Gooseneck will celebrate, and possibly Possum Creek. These are two questions which every year create is almost as much comment and eager inquiry in white circles as they do among the colored and Indian population of the city and surrounding country. As yet, the journal has heard of no plans for the big emancipation celebration at Possums Creek, but the move is started for Gooseneck, the original spot of the big doings. The celebration this year at Gooseneck will commence on August 1st and last until August 5th. Today is August 5th. And the first day's program is scheduled as a big day, a grand parade on horseback, and sham battle will be the distinctive features of the day. On the second day will be held a big racing meet and a baseball game as promised. On the third day, there will be a sort of field day and foot racing. I love the word term foot race. Why is it just race? But my husband and my brother-in-law, they love the term foot race. I think it's ESPN. Just blame that. And so after we do the foot racing, we're going to do horse racing and jumping, and will be indulged in. On the fourth day, Rufus Thomas will deliver an address of welcome. Professor Grubbs will read the Emancipation Proclamation. A special choir will furnish music, and the Gooseneck Band, which will be in attendance during the whole of the doings, will give a special concert. You guys see, like, people think, oh, we just started doing. No, our ancestors were commemorating freedom. This was a thing, but they didn't do it on June 15th. Okay. So the reason why I knew that this was Freedmen, Cherokee Freedmen, and this is in a newspaper in Coffeyville. Coffeyville is in the southeastern part of Kansas, but it butts right up against the Cherokee Nation, the northern part of the Cherokee Nation. And it's an area where a bunch of Cherokee freedmen settled. They went into that area during the Civil War, and then they came back down into like the northern part of the Cherokee Nation. Veneta, Nowata, Miami, that's what they call Miami, but it looks like Miami. They settled there. And all these people, George Van, Walter French, Wash French, Eli Ney, George Musgrove, Ryder Van, those are all Cherokee freedmen. All of them are Cherokee freedmen who have planned this. Someone said they're laughing at Rufus Thomas, right? You're thinking of the guy from Stax Records. Whoops, let me go back. Uh-oh, I went way too far. Okay. So another one of these Emancipation Day celebrations is, this one is a little bit harder to read. It talks about the Delaware District in the Cherokee Nation. And they talk about the 24th day of August. You see how August keeps coming up. The reason why August keeps coming up is because that is when the Caribbean celebrated freedom. Yes, Tracy. You okay?
I'm trying to see if I can make the chat smaller.
Oh, okay.
So I'm going to deselect the chat previews. Okay.
Okay. Good. All right. So this was in the Cherokee Advocate, which was a paper in Tahlequah. This was on September 9th, 1876. So the paper I just showed you was from 1904. This one is from 1876, you all. So this is within 11 years of slavery being abolished in the United States. But you have to remember that the treaties of 1866 are what abolished slavery in the Indian Territory. The Indian Territory was its own, had basically each nation was its own country within the confines of the United States. So the 13th Amendment and the Emancipation Proclamation technically did not apply to the Indian Territory. So while we celebrate 1865 in the US, Indian Territory, it's really 1866. And you see, they've got a whole bunch of things outlined. They talk about the 24th day of August was celebrated by the freedmen of this and adjoining districts. Again, the Cherokee Nation is broken into districts. Now, of course, it's counties because it's Oklahoma, but they talk about how the freedmen in the respective districts, Kewaskum, Delaware, Illinois, how they were celebrating freedom. And who came to speak. What they did was they brought back men who were veterans of the Civil War who fought for their freedom to speak. One of those men, I want to say this is where Arthur Bean got up and spoke as a veteran of the 1st Kansas. All right, and then last one, this is another one. You see here, August 1st, it keeps coming back, right? This one, the left is from the Fulton, Kansas Independent on September 5th, 1885. And you see it says, actually, no, the one on the left is June 30th of 1881. And that's from Topeka, Kansas. But no, it says that in Bismarck Grove, Lawrence, Kansas, they're going to be celebrating the 47th anniversary of the West India Emancipation. And you're like, wait a minute, 47th in 1881? You have to remember, you all, that British colonial dependencies which were considered West Indian nations, they were freed a whole 30 years. Slavery ended a whole 30 years earlier there than it did in the United States. Right? Look at this. The best oratorial talent of the nation, both colored and white, have been invited to address the meeting, consisting of the following distinguished gentlemen. Do you see that that says Frederick Douglass came to Lawrence, Kansas and spoke in 1881? Because it's right there. Honorable Frederick Douglass. So again, the concept that June 15th was everywhere, nope. I'm abolishing that for you all today, especially when we're talking about Indian territory. Then in this paper from Fulton, Kansas, they talk about the people of Fulton, Timber Hill, Mapleton. Those are all areas right around or in Bourbon County, Kansas, and how they got together on September 22nd. All right, moving on. So how do you tell whether or not you were connected to the Cherokee Nation in particular? Okay. And the number one question that you need to ask yourself is, where was your family living? It's always where. And if it's not the Cherokee Nation, which groups were living in a respective geographical area? That's the number one question, is who and where were they at? If you have ancestors who were in Western counties in North Carolina, Eastern counties in Tennessee, I'm talking about Chattanooga, Knoxville, Georgia, and Northern counties. And if you go west of Georgia into Alabama, it's Northern counties in Alabama, but that area of Georgia and Alabama in the north borders against Tennessee in the east, right? Just think of it's a big blob. There's also counties in South Carolina in the western part of South Carolina. Now, the reason why I have this qualified as circa 1812 is you have to remember that there's a pre-removal era and a post-removal era. The forced removal itself took place in the 1830s, but individuals within the nation were going to what is now Oklahoma or the Indian Territory beginning about 1812. They voluntarily removed because there were several treaties that were signed and people were willing to give their land up in the Cherokee Nation East and come and settle on land that had the same acreage as what they had in the East. They were willing to settle on that in the Indian Territory. And those folks that came on their own volition and were not forcibly removed are called old settlers. If you hear that term used, that means that those people came on their own, they were not forced out. Okay. And those folks were coming primarily from these areas. I can't necessarily give you a county, so to speak, because our boundary lines that we use right now are arbitrary. It's not the same as it is now. So you want to have ancestors that are from this area. Now, when we move into the removal era, which is in the 1830s, and people start going into what is now Oklahoma and the Indian Territory, we have to expand this out some, because once folks were forcibly removed, some people came into what is now Oklahoma. There's even a contingency that settled in East Texas. Just look at the county names. Cherokee. There's a reason why the county is called Cherokee County, Texas, is because Cherokee settled there. If you're looking in Oklahoma more recently, you're looking at Washington, Nowata, Craig, Ottawa. How many of you knew that the northern part of Tulsa County is Cherokee Nation? Yes, this information's on the handout. Someone's asking that in the chat. Yeah. We're talking, yeah, I heard somebody in the room. Yeah, northern part of Tulsa is Cherokee Nation, or was Cherokee Nation, which is why when they told the story, or people were telling the story of the Tulsa Race Massacre, they were talking about, and they brought up Freedmen of the Five Tribes, they specifically talked about Cherokee. Because who was coming to spend their money in Greenwood but Cherokee Freedmen? You also have Rogers, Mays, Delaware, Cherokee, Adair, Muskogee, Sequoia, and the eastern portion of McIntosh County, because McIntosh was Choctaw. The other part of it was Choctaw. Texas, you've got East Texas counties like Cherokee, Gregg, Rusk, Van Zant, um, other areas of interest. And these are secondary compared to the ones on the left-hand side of this slide. Arkansas, if you're talking Fort Smith, Crawford County, if you're up near, right up next to the Cherokee Nation, or the western part of the state that goes right up against the Indian Territory, some of the old settlers settled there before they went and they were pushed into what is now Oklahoma. You also have to count eastern counties in Kansas, like I just talked about, Bourbon County, which is like Fort Scott, Coffeyville, that whole area going down, even all the way up to Kansas City, which we can talk a little bit about that later. A lot of freedmen, Cherokee freedmen in particular, settled there. You also have southwestern counties in Missouri, like Joplin, or that's a city, Joplin, any of that part that's there. All right, so the first section that we're going to talk about are the Cherokee rolls, okay? And these are records that are specifically connected to the Cherokee Nation. These are Cherokee Nation, okay? We're going to talk about federal records. We're going to talk about state records. But you've got to break it into parts because that's how voluminous the information is. So the first roll that we're going to talk about are immigration rolls, and that's immigration with an E. Those are documents or rolls where people who were being removed, whether voluntarily or not, were being documented. And these vary by year. They're not going to have a consistency of the dates or the years like the United States Census does. You're going to see the name of the person who was in charge of what's called the detachment. That is and you see how the sun is just creeping on out, all in my eye. Wasn't even here earlier. You see how dreary it was, and all of a sudden it's like, either way, the immigration rolls are going to have who led the detachment. They're going to have who was in a part of the group, who the head of household was, how many people were a part of that, and the demographical information on them, as well as the number of enslaved people. Now, if you were not aware, if you didn't come to the documentary screening, and if you don't know, the 5 slave-holding tribes, that's what we call them, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskogee Creek, and Seminole Nations, practice chattel slavery. So there are people who are descendants of their formerly enslaved, people who were enslaved by citizens of their nations, and there are people who are descendants of both those enslaved and the people who were citizens or by blood. In my experience, most freedmen, people whose ancestors were relegated to a status of just being former slaves, have a degree of Indian blood or are related to people who are considered to be by blood and are issued a certificate of degree of Indian blood card by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. I have yet to see a freedman that does not have any scenario that is not related to anybody that has by blood ancestors. Haven't come across it, not even one time. So you're going to see on these rolls, the immigration rolls, you're going to see the number of slaves. Every time you think of the Trail of Tears, yes, think about all the people that were forced at gunpoint to leave their homes and lands that they didn't want to leave, but also think about the thousands of enslaved people who were carrying their bags and their stuff. Now, after you have the various immigration rolls, and we're going to see examples of all of this, we also have what's called the Tompkins roll. That documents the Cherokee and the Delaware. And one of the things you have to also think about is that several other nations were folded into the Cherokee Nation at one point or another. The Delaware were also combined into the Cherokee. They became a part of the Cherokee, even though they themselves did not start off as Cherokees, they were folded in at one point or another. And so this 1867 Tompkins roll documents the folks who were in the Indian Territory, who were in the Cherokee Nation right after the war ended. Because remember, Civil War technically ends in 1865. This is within 2 years, but everyone hadn't necessarily returned back yet because there were Civil War battles in the Indian Territory. So that means that there's chaos. You're not going to stay around there shooting cannons and whatnot in your backyard. You're going to leave. So a bunch of the Cherokees by blood and air quotes, a bunch of Cherokees and Cherokee freedmen, they fled into Missouri, they fled into Texas, and they fled into Kansas. And based on the stipulations of the treaty that ended slavery, you had to return back to the Cherokee Nation within 6 months of the treaty date. So some folks got the memo earlier, some of them got it later. You got to remember, we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have any of that. So it basically was carrier pigeon um, and notices in the newspaper. If you were literate, right, if you could read, and someone could tell you what was going on. There's also the Cherokee census from 1880 and 1883. When we have these censuses or rolls, they're typically created so that they could pay out some sort of annuity or some sort of benefit. For 1880, there was a huge amount of starvation and people needing food in the Cherokee Nation. And so when you hear people refer to bread money, meaning people getting money for breadstuffs or rations, right? In order for them to know how many people that they needed to give, potential food to, they had to make a list. And that's what the Cherokee census from 1880 was. When you hear people talk about grass money, that's when the federal government paid the Cherokee Nation a sum of money because they allowed people to come in and settle on land that belonged to the Cherokee Nation. The Indian Territory, the bounds of it were so wide until speculators started coming in and seeing the opportunity to allow other folks to come in and encroach on the land. And so it kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And you remember, this is around the time, it's a little bit earlier than the land runs. The land runs began in Oklahoma in the 1890s, where they're literally, you guys have seen the old school movies where the folks are on the wagons running with the horses, trying to go and sit on the land, sit on the plot of land that's theirs. A lot of times those folks, that land was coming from Native American tribes. They were encroaching on that land. So I just want you to keep that in mind. So 1883 is where the money was dispersed for the fact that the federal government allowed Americans, right? Again, you have to talk about it because it's different countries. They allowed Americans to come in and settle on Cherokee land. So that's what that money is from. And that's what that list is created. So here's a broad view of one of the immigration rolls or related rolls. This is the Henderson roll. And this documents individuals and families and enslaved people who were forcibly removed. People who were on this roll are folks who were forced off, who did not choose on their own volition to go to the Cherokee Nation West, right? Didn't want to move. So they were forced out. Let's see. All right. Let's come in closer so you all can see it. Now, this is a little bit hard to see, but this is why I kind of have it, boxed off. Here's George Fields, who's a Cherokee. You see they're counting the males and the females in his household. And note, in the column that has information for slaves, you see there are no slaves in that column. So there's 7 total people. He's got, different concentration of male and female, but there's 7 total, okay? When you go to the right-hand side, there is a column for mixed Negroes. And note that that is separate from slaves because there were free people of color or individuals who were not enslaved, who were in the Cherokee Nation. Just like how we had free people of color in the United States, there were free people of color living within the Indian nations. And so they delineated out mixed Negroes. A mixed Negro is going to be somebody, again, who is both of African descent and of Cherokee descent, and also could be of European descent as well. This is an example of the Tompkins roll. And the Tompkins roll, again, most of these rolls are going to be very long. If you've ever looked at like a census for the United States prior to 1850, you're used to this sort of format where it's horizontal and it's long because they roll it out. All of the columns have information. And this is in the Saline District in the Cherokee Nation. When we zoom in closer, we see Jesse Van, Katie Van, Ben Van, Sally Van, Ruth Van, William Van, and Jane Van. And I want to point out that Katie Van that's listed here is my third great grandmother. Jesse is my third great grandfather. And Sally, which is a nickname for Sarah, is my second great grandmother. Katie was one of the mixed Negroes that was a part of that detachment or was on the Henderson roll with George Fields. Her maiden name was Fields. You also know, again, you're going to get your typical stuff like their age, gender identity. Note that they have color here. They've got Indian, white, half-breed, and color. And you've got all these tick marks of all the Black people there. There's also additional information that is on these rolls, like the value of the real estate, the acres of land, what kind of livestock they had, all that kind of stuff. So when we move forward to 1880, you see how the form has shifted a bit. And with the Tompkins roll and with the Henderson roll, those rolls are just based off of who showed up and in the order they went in, whereas the 1880 is all alphabetical. And when we zoom in closely to 1880, we see Sally Rogers, who was on the 1867 Tompkins roll that you just saw. In her household is Nelson Van Rogers, who is my great uncle. And they're there together. I'm going to give you a clue. If you are trying to find out or validate whether an ancestor is your ancestor, one of the ways that you can validate that is to cross-check it with this 1880 census and the Dawes cards. When they were creating the Dawes cards, they would go back and refer to the 1880 Cherokee census to make sure that people, it was their way of saying, okay, you had to come back within 6 months of the treaty. So that's what was that, like January, early 1867. And yes, you could be on the Tompkins roll, but we know you were for sure back if you were on the 1880 Cherokee census. So you'll see in this column right here that didn't have any information written in it, they would stamp things like dead, or they'd have a number here. What the number signifies is the Dawes roll number. So this number will take you back to the Dawes roll, which is not for another 20 years after this. If the person was still alive, they wrote it in. If they were dead by the time the Dawes Commission happened, they stamped dead. And you see a bunch of different numbers. FD, that's Freedmen Doubtful. We're going to talk about what that is. They even have notes that says married out. Pay attention to all of the notes. All right, more rolls. We have several censuses that took place. And notice again, there are arbitrary dates. They're not like on this, like this, the federal census was 1870, 1880, 1890, 1900. It's gonna be usually, again, there had to be a purpose. There was a reason why they were counting the people. And usually, again, it had something to do with paying out some sort of benefit. So we've got 1886, 1890, 1893, and 1896, where folks outside of the nation, again, and this is the other parts of my family, where we are starved trying to find information between 1881 and 1899 because there is no federal census. In the Cherokee Nation, we don't care because look at how many rolls we have. We haven't even gotten to some of the other records that exist. Just for censuses, you got about 5 or 6 that you could pull up between that time period. So this is 1890. Again, remember, horizontal information on every single column, okay? When we zoom in, we're gonna find a Sarah Rogers, but this is not my Sarah Rogers. My Sarah Rogers died. My Sarah Rogers was married to a man named Ike Rogers. And Ike Rogers, after Grandma Sarah passed away, he married her sister Ruth, who was on that Tompkins roll we saw earlier. Then Ruth dropped dead, and then he married another Sarah. Her name was Sarah Fry. Here is Sarah Fry in 1890 with the first Sarah's son, Nelson, my great grandfather, who was the first Sarah's son with Ike, and then Sarah Fry and Ike Rogers' children, Ethel and Andrew underneath. There's a question, were there some people who weren't listed as dead who simply didn't come back or went to other states and so forth? No, from my experience, I've never found that. On 1880, remember, it was a litmus test or it was a check against who was applying for the Dawes. And when they were interviewing people for Dawes, you're going to find out Dawes is literally, who's your mother? Where were you born? How old are you? What district do you live in? Were you here at this date? And if they couldn't corroborate it with you, they were interviewing other witnesses to validate when the person passed away. So I haven't found that somebody was stamped dead and they weren't. Mm-mm. And if they went out, they mention it in the Dawes file. Now you see there's stuff around literacy, how many dwellings they have, the number of acres, farms, and cultivation, all that kind of stuff. This 1890 roll is not alphabetical, it's by household. All right, more. Wallace roll and the Kern Clifton, those are specifically about freedmen, individuals who were formerly enslaved or their ancestors were formerly enslaved by the Cherokee Nation. And these particular rolls were developed because there was always, and even now, even with Dawes, there are errors, people were left off. And even though they have proof, the nation will not accept anything for citizenship purposes that is not connected to the Dawes roll. Like you have to have an ancestor who was approved on the Dawes roll. Back, in the day, they knew that folks were left off of 1880. They knew folks were left off of 1890. So they commissioned a specific roll that was just for freedmen. So Wallace roll, Kern Clifton roll, those two are specifically for Cherokee freedmen. So if you find anybody on those, we know that they were enslaved or their ancestors were enslaved by people in the nation. There's also additional records. So remember, these are nations within the confines of the United States, right? They're their own countries. That's why people have their citizenship in the nation. Is I'm a citizen of that country and I'm a citizen. It's like having dual passports, right? When I have my citizenship card, there is no date. There's no end date. It says indefinite. Why? Because I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and I'm a citizen of the United States. So it's basically operating like two passports. So there are marriage records that exist in the Cherokee Nation before the Cherokee Nation at that point got absorbed into the state of Oklahoma. There are marriages, there are court records. So all of this, again, is just under this first bucket of records within the Cherokee Nation. So I talked about Isaac Rogers a second ago. This is the marriage license for him and Aunt Ruth. Remember, after he married the first Sarah, or Sally Van, he married Ruth Van, her sister. This certifies that Isaac Rogers was the one part colored man and Ruthie Van, colored woman, were married and bound in holy matrimony on the 27th day of August, 1883. Sam Weber, minister of the gospel, William Worker, and Sarah Weber, witnesses. So these are records within the Cherokee Nation. Additionally, if you recall Jesse Van from the Tompkins roll that we showed you, or that I showed you earlier with Sally and Ruth as his daughters, here he is he basically is speaking in the form of an affidavit on behalf of someone else to secure their citizenship. There were several times where freedmen approached the Cherokee Nation courts to basically give a sign off on them being considered citizens. And people went as individuals and did that, and they would have folks give affidavits. And so this one says, Jesse Van, colored, of the Cherokee Nation in Indian Territory. He is a person of African descent, that his age is 35 years and his occupation is a farmer. And later on, it goes to talk about how he knows the person and has been in community with them and how they should be entitled to their citizenship. All right, so now that we've gone through Cherokee records, now we have to talk about federal records, which are from the US government. If you wanted to know what Ike Rogers looked like, well, you're looking at a picture of him. He is a very infamous man. And if you watch The Harder They Fall on Netflix with Idris Elba, Regina King, Lakeith Stanfield, Jonathan Majors. Lakeith Stanfield played Cherokee Bill, and in that film, Cherokee Bill died by getting shot in the neck and bleeding out in the middle of a town square, and that is not what happened. That man was actually hung, and the person who captured the outlaw was the man that you're looking at, Ike Rogers, my great-great-grandfather, who was a Civil War veteran and a U.S. Deputy Marshal for the hanging Judge Isaac Parker in Fort Smith, Arkansas. All right, let's talk about records from the Bureau of the Indian Affairs, Civil War, Dawes Commission, and beyond. The federal government has been known for documenting the nations. And If you are researching in an area that has nothing to do with the five tribes, and maybe there was records destruction, meaning the courthouse burned down or a major repository burned down, one of the ways that you can work around that is to go into federal records, because they didn't have the records destruction like the courthouse did. So that's one way to work around that. All right. Dawes cards. You've heard me talk about this a lot. What are the Dawes cards? The Dawes Act was named after Henry Dawes, and it was set up so that they could apportion land in equal portions to folks in the that were in the Indian nations. Why was that done? Because Oklahoma was a territory, was established as a territory, and was about to become a state. And within the Cherokee Nation, we did not have deeds like we have like now, right? All land that was in the nation was held in common. It was everybody's land. If I wanted to live here for 10 years and pick up and go somewhere else, I could totally do that. And I have to do a deed. I didn't have to do any of that stuff. But in order for us to have everyone to get equal portions of land, they had to count everyone. They had to validate that they were citizens. And in order for them to get their allotment, they had to go through the Dawes process. And that process started in the late 1890s, okay? Most of the applications that I see, folks were applying about 1901. And so if a person applied, regardless of if they got approved, they have a card. And those cards could be just what are called a regular card. They have doubtful ones, meaning like, I don't really think this person should be entitled. And then they also have rejected. You could start on a doubtful card and go to a regular approved card, or you could start on a doubtful card and go to rejected. If someone starts off on a doubtful card, they typically have two different numbers, which means that they're going to have two different applications, which means two different sets of documents to look through. If they're just on an approved, there's only going to be one application. You only get to the allotment stage when you get approved. You did not get a land allotment, and thus you did not get citizenship unless you were approved. If you find an ancestor and you know that they are your ancestor and they're on a rejected card, you cannot get citizenship in the Cherokee Nation. And at current, besides the Seminole Nation, if you're connected to the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, or Muskogee Creek Nation, and your ancestor is on an approved Dawes card, meaning they're not on a rejected one, they're on an approved one, you are not entitled to citizenship in those nations. They do not grant citizenship to their freedmen. The only nations that grant citizenship to their freedmen are the Cherokee Nation and the Seminole Nation. That's it. And no, you can't go call Deb Haaland at the Bureau of Indian Affairs and argue your case. The nations determine what their citizenship requirements are. And even if there is an error, I've seen where two sisters, two full-blood sisters, right? Like they have the exact same parents. One married a freedman, the other one married a by blood. And both of them were not granted citizenship, even though the citizenship was based on their family. You can't go back and correct it. The nation will tell you that it's the most complete set of records they have, and they know it has errors. Okay. So it's a 3-step process. For some people, it's 2, but if the person was approved, it's 3. It's the card, which then goes to an application, which then goes to an allotment. We also have the Eastern Cherokee applications, or what are called the Guion Miller. And the Eastern Cherokee are based off of folks who were forcibly removed. So these are the people who didn't go voluntarily. They're not the old settlers. These are folks and the formerly enslaved who were part of the Trail of Tears and who 70 years later were requesting that the US government compensate them for losses that they expended on that journey. And these applications are incredible. I haven't seen a freedman be approved on a single one, but what we use them for is for genealogical information. And you're going to see how rich they are in just a second. Also, the 1860 slave schedules. Slave schedules were done in 1850 and they were done in 1860. And all they did was count the formerly enslaved. There are a few exceptions in the United States where the US Marshals actually recorded the names. They weren't supposed to record the name of the enslaved. So that was two opportunities in our US history where there could have been a national list of enslaved people, and our US Congress said, nope, we're not going to do it. I want you to know that in British colonial dependencies, oh honey, they had lists of slaves several years, back to back to back. So this is where the Brits outdid us yet again. But the slave schedules in Arkansas, you will find that the 5 tribes have slave schedules, but when you go to search for them, you have to look in Arkansas. The reason why is because that is where the closest federal court was in Fort Smith, Arkansas. That's why they bundled them in with Arkansas. We also have the census in Arkansas, Kansas, Missouri, and Texas. And the reason why I qualify this is because remember, there were folks doing a lot of migrating. And in addition to migrating, again, within the nation, folks were also going to these other states at some point. So if they went there, you will find them on a census. We do not have a federal census in Oklahoma until 1900. Oklahoma Territory does not get in, right? Does not become a state till 1907. So we don't have a federal census in Oklahoma before the 1900 census, which is why, again, we talked about all the various roles. This is why these roles are important, is because they supplement a federal US census. But if your family went into Kansas, they went into Arkansas, Missouri, or Texas, you're going to have a federal census. Now, some folks, when they come across records for the Dawes, they will see these books that are like this. This is an example of one that's on Ancestry. It's just a scan of an old book, and it's an index of all the individuals who are approved for a Dawes card. That's all it is. These are all the folks who got approved. And you see information like the name, the Dawes roll number, the age of the person, gender identity, and the field number for the Dawes card, but you get no other information. I have seen folks literally take this list and like go crazy with it. Oh, this is my family. And well, how do you know? It's literally just the name. You've got to search, right? You've got to connect. Remember, when I told you Dawes is 3 parts. For some people, 2. For people who got approved, it's 3. This is just telling you who got in. This is not accounting for all the people who applied and who were rejected. So do not take this to the bank, okay? You want to go further. So with this, you see Nelson, Uncle Nelson, who we saw in the 1880 Cherokee. We saw him on that 1890 Cherokee census, along with the 1890 Cherokee census with my great-grandfather, Grandpa Cooey. You see them listed there together. Their Dawes roll numbers are right next to each other. The only thing that you can bank on for these final roll lists is that most times the folks who are listed next to folks are going to be related to them, or they might be neighbors. People would ride to the Dawes Commission in wagons. They would catch a ride, and you will see swaths of families and neighbors go together. And so what I will say is with this, you see Nelson and Cooey, and then right above them, you see Ethel and Ray and Roy. Those were their siblings. Those were their half siblings. Now let's look at an actual Dawes card. Because one of the things that I want to point out about Dawes cards is that for freedmen, or people who were perceived to have African blood, or who were descended from the formerly enslaved of the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskogee Creek, and Seminole nations, our cards have 2 sides. The quote, by blood cards only have 1 side. What you will also notice for the freedmen cards is that they do not record a degree of Indian blood. So if someone had it, it's not there for you to record it. Now, remember what I said about most freedmen I know having connections back to people, genetic connections back to people on the by blood roll, right? It doesn't matter in terms of the nation, in terms of the federal government. They do not care that we don't have a degree of Indian blood on this card. We cannot go back and add it. They don't accept DNA. But we know what it says, and we know what our oral history says. So on this front card, right, again, freedmen cards have 2 sides. You're going to see the person's name. You're going to know if the person got into the Dawes Commission and approved a couple ways. This column here says Dawes roll number. If the person got approved, there's going to be a number right here. If they did not, you're not going to see a stamped number. You also will have a stamp that says citizenship certificate issued for whoever the person is and the date that it was issued. There's also a ton of other information on this card, like the date the person applied. So my great-grandfather applied on May 17th, 1901, but he didn't get his citizenship certificate issued until September 22nd of 1904. You'll note that it tells you, you've got your primary person, sort of like a head of household. It's just him at this point. He had not married my great-grandmother yet. His age, gender identity, the role that he was on, the last tribal enrollment. So this one was from 1896. They note the page number he was on. Then they talk about his mother being on the 1880 roll, the number that she had and how she was listed. They also tell me that he has kids that were a part of the Dawes Commission, because it says CFNB number 181. That means Freedmen newborn. That means a minor child. There's a Freedmen newborn card for two of my aunts. My grandmother's sisters were alive for the Dawes Commission. And so they are on a Freedmen newborn card that's connected to this one. Another thing that I don't want to gloss over is that you see there's 18 spaces. So if a household had 18 people, they could have all those folks on a Dawes card. And that's stressing me out. For 18 people on the Dawes, that's too many people in one house. But they were doing it. It says slave of. I want you guys to look at this. It says slave of. If you do research outside of the Indian Territory, the majority of us are spinning our wheels trying to find out who a slave owner is. In the nation, they just tell you. Now, you see, for my great-grandfather, it doesn't have a name of a slave owner because he was born after slavery ended. But when we go to the back of his card, because remember, Freedmen cards have two sides, you note that his father's name is Isaac Rogers. As of him applying, Ike is dead, yes, because Cherokee Bill's brother shot and killed him in broad daylight in Fort Gibson, Oklahoma in 1897. So Ike Rogers just missed the Dawes Commission. So he's dead. They note that where he was living was in the Kuliskuwi district, which is where my great-grandfather was from. No, it tells you the name of the parent slave owners. For the father, it was Elzira Price May, who was Cherokee by blood. She was an old settler, along with Sally Vann. Again, we've been seeing her name. We saw her on the 1867 Tompkins. We saw her on 1880 Cherokee census, and she's dead as well. She was living in the Kuliskuwi district. And note, for her mother's owner, it has a check. Her mother did not have a slaveholder. Remember, she was free because her mother was a part of that group of mixed Negroes who were forcibly removed and were a part of the household of George Fields in 1835. So we don't have a slaveholder for her. Now, you're going to take this card and you're going to go to an application jacket. And the application is going to be typed. And if the person was a clear-cut case, it's a short file. It's not going to have more than 10 pages. But if a person was rejected, it is going to have more than 10 pages. And remember I mentioned folks could have a doubtful card and a rejected card, which means they have two separate application jackets. Read both of them. Do not assume that they're exactly the same, because they may not be. So you see here on May 17, 1901, in the matter of the application of Cooey Van Rogers for enrollment as a Cherokee freedman, and it says she, he is not a she, he's a he, being sworn by the Commissioner C.R. Breckenridge, testified. Thank you. Annalisa says Cooey is a wonderful name. His name was Theodore Kuwiskuwi Van Rogers, and Kuwiskuwi means cool water, but it was also a name of a district in the Cherokee Nation, which is where he was born and which is where my family is from, the Kuliskuwi district. They ask him, how old are you? What's your post office address? What district do you live in? Who is it that you want to have enrolled besides yourself? How long have you lived in the district? Give me the name of your father. Give me the name of your mother. Are they dead? How long has your father been dead? How long has your mother been dead? On which role do your parents appear, right? You see how it's all lineal, right? It's all descendancy. You couldn't just walk in here and not have any proof. But even if you did, sometimes they rejected you anyway. So if the person ended up getting approved, then you end up with an allotment. And that is where they would go in and stake a claim, usually for the land that they were already living on. Like, I just want to stay where I'm at. And they would describe things like, did you make any improvements to the land? And you see, they even give you the legal land description, the township, the range, and the section. So if you wanted to go and map this out to figure out where it was, you could go right to the allotment. Now, for Eastern Cherokee, I talked about this earlier. Oh my gosh, this is probably, I would say, next to the Dawes interviews, like the one you just saw that was super short. Some of them may be going back and forth on baby daddies. No lie. The first slide I showed you guys with the title with my great great grandmother on there, they went back and forth about whether or not her husband was white. They literally interviewed people. Was he white or was he black? How would they generally accept it? And people said the man was white because they were legally married in the state of Kansas. And I'm like, what does this have to do with her getting her citizenship? This has nothing to do with him. But they talked about that kind of stuff in those Dawes files. They were, oh my gosh. Sometimes you gotta literally close the laptop because it's too much with some of the questions and just all of that. But I'm grateful that we have the first person voices, though. That's the one thing that I am grateful for. Now, for the Eastern Cherokee applications, again, this is 70 years after the forced removal. So the individuals who are applying, it could be themselves, it could be their parents, it could be their grandparents that were on the forced removal. This is an example from Dennis Van. They know he lists his Indian name, which is Walala. He lives in Catoosa, and it lists his birth date, the district that he was born in, which was in the Saline district. He claims through his mother and his father. They list his wife's name, the parents' names, along with their Indian names, where they were born, where they were residing in 1851. And the reason why they have that as a fixed year is because there was a roll made in 1851 of all the people who were forcibly removed who got to the Cherokee Nation. The folks who survived the trail, they were on a roll in 1851. So that's why they asked, where were they living? So then that way they could go and cross-reference to see if they were actually there. Then the next page, because remember, if you are younger than 70, you're going to have to prove your connection back. So then they asked you the names of your siblings and when they were born and when they died. Then they asked you the name of your grandparents. I have never seen another document in genealogy that does this, where it's asking not just for you and your parents and their birthplaces and their respective names, but it's asking you for your siblings and their birth dates and their death dates and your grandparents on both sides. And then where the grandparents were born, then it asks you where your aunts and uncles from your grandparents was born and where they live and what their names are. This is literally 3 generations worth of information, but also think about this. If you're younger, it could be 4 or 5 generations. So when you start, one of the benefits of all these documents that we have is that, yes, you can just look at one Dawes card, but you should be pulling people from an entire family. So yes, your Cooey, Grandpa Cooey, he has his card, got his approval, wonderful. But I'm not going to stop at him. I'm going to go to Nelson. Uncle Nelson got a land allotment. I'm pulling his. I'm pulling Aunt Ethel, Uncle Ray, and Uncle Roy's. I'm going to the aunts and the uncles. You see how one immediate family can have 25 Dawes applications, which then means that they can have 25 Eastern Cherokee. And not everybody is going to report the same information. So you might get details from one that you didn't get from the other one. So note here for Dennis Van, he says that his grandmother is named Katie Van. Remember Katie Van? And that one of her children was named Jesse Van, which goes back to 1867, which is the father of my Sarah Van. You got to have your tree so that you can follow all these people. But look at all these folks. It's nuts. And that's how I was able to recreate their family tree. Here's an example of the Dawes. Actually, this is 1860 slave schedules. Remember, I told you that Arkansas is where you will find the slave schedules for the Indian Territory. You'll see at the top it says slave inhabitants of Saline District of Cherokee Nation. You see they crossed out county, it says Cherokee Nation. And you see Sarah Martin's got her enslaved. And then in yellow highlighted towards the bottom is Ellis McDaniel, who is marked with the word or the initials IND after his name for Indian. More federal records. Of course, now that we're getting past 1870, 1880, 1900, right? Got the territorial census. You're going to look in the federal census wherever your folks ended up. That means from 1910 to 1950 and beyond. We are in Arkansas, Kansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, Texas. And the reason why we have to include all of these, in addition to Washington and California, is that freedmen, some of them are still in the, in the nation, but many of them migrated out. And the number one place they went was Kansas City, Kansas, or Kansas City, Missouri. There are huge communities. In fact, y'all, I was in Dallas last weekend and I was with one of my cousins on this side of the family, and we were at a friend of his house. He's like, oh yeah, because the fight was on. And yeah, let's go to my buddy's house, blah, blah, blah. Okay, we stopped by there. And he's like, yeah, everybody here's from Kansas City. And I was like, okay, so that means they're probably freedmen. And he was like, how do you know that? And I was like, because Black folks didn't just appear in Kansas City. They had to get there from somewhere else. And usually, if they are Black folks from Kansas City, Kansas, or Kansas City, Missouri, but mostly Kansas City, Kansas, those folks are freedmen of the 5 tribes. He was like, I don't understand how you know this. I said, I'm going to start asking questions. So then the guy whose house, who was the host, I said, where are you from? He was like, Kansas City. I said, no, before your folks got to Kansas City. He's like, how do you know that? I was like, trust me. He said, Idabel, Oklahoma. I was not wrong. I said, there you go. So you guys are probably Choctaw Freedmen. He was like, you're right. Trust me. Kansas City, Kansas is a hub, just like Seattle, Washington is a hub, or Pasco, Washington State is a hub. LA is a hub. Chicago is a hub, but primarily Kansas City, Kansas, and Missouri. You're also going to look at other records. This collection, what is called Microfilm Publication 234, is records of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It is not just the Cherokee Nation, it is also other Indian nations. It is voluminous. It's like 3,000 rolls of microfilm. It's crazy. It is not indexed, meaning you can't just type in a name and search it. You have to manually browse it, but there is some great information in there as well. The 1900 Cherokee, the Cherokees are documented in the territorial census. It's going to look just like the census outside, but it's going to say Indian Territory, and the county is going to say whatever the 5 tribes is. In this instance, this is Cherokee. And when we zoom in closer on this page, we see Uncle Nelson along. And there they are together. Their allotments adjoining. I don't know why they listed them as partners, because they're brothers. But no, they're born in the Indian Territory. Says their mother is born in the Indian Territory. I don't know why they didn't know where Ike was born, but I kind of feel like this might have been reported by somebody else. It's not until we get to the 1940 census that who reported the information. This could have came from neighbors. All right, there's Uncle Roy in the middle right there with Aunt Julia and his sister, his cousin. That's Ike's daughter, Roy's daughter, Osime. Now just so y'all know, this a little fun fact. Julia ran a brothel. Miss Julia right here, she ran a brothel in Kansas City, not far from 12th and Vine, where all the jazz clubs were. And honey, she was so cold, her brothel was across the street from a church. Lord today. All right. I guess they got the spirit in 2 places that Sunday. Anyway, so Fort Smith, right, they probably did go every Sunday. Fort Smith criminal case. I talked about the nearest federal court being in Fort Smith, Arkansas. Well, that means if there were any judicial issues, right, people who were doing murder, stuff like that, if they were tried, they were going to be tried at the federal court in Fort Smith. And so that's how you end up with a lot of Black U.S. deputy marshals outside of Bass Reeves, because everybody hyper focuses on Bass Reeves like he is the only Black U.S. Marshal, and he was not. There were way more than that. But you will find your ancestors. I don't think there's a single person that has not found somebody in a Fort Smith criminal case file for like bootlegging. Like that was probably like the biggest case that you would just always, people would always get arrested for alcohol violations. But you will find those files. Those are online. Civil War, big deal in the Indian Territory, in particular, Cherokee freedmen. The reason why is because the Indian nation sided with the Confederacy. Okay? 5 tribes sided with the Confederacy for the most part. There were contingencies of people who did not, but by and large, they did. And when you get the Confiscation Acts, the Militia Act that allows for the recruitment of Black men, freedmen of the 5 tribes enlisted primarily in about 5 regiments in the Civil War. The 1st Kansas, which became the U.S. Colored Troop 79th, that was the first, hear me. I know y'all love Denzel and Morgan Freeman and Matthew Broderick and Isaiah Washington and all of them in glory. And y'all have heard about the 54th Massachusetts. That was not the 1st unit. It was the 1st Kansas, which was made up of freedmen of the 5 tribes, was the first to be recruited, to go into battle, and to suffer casualties. The first. Now, the 54th gets counted higher because they were mustered into federal service earlier, but it wasn't until the 1st Kansas had been organized. Oh no, they weren't even recruiting the 54th. Within 2 months, you all, these men were recruited in Kansas in August of 1862, and they did their first battle and won with the wrong uniforms and faulty guns in 2 months. Y'all see how, listen, 1st Kansas is my unit because it was made up of Cherokee freedmen. 2nd Kansas was organized after the 1st Kansas. They became the 83rd U.S. Colored Troops. Then you have the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Indian Home Guards, which were made up of Black men, freedmen, and Indians. It was a multiracial unit to guard the Indian Territory. And if any of the men who were in those regiments are connected to you and they applied for pensions with the federal government, those are records. So you've got service cards or muster cards, which tell you how much money they were getting paid every couple of months. They have pension cards, they have pension files, hundreds of pages where you're getting that first person account, just like with the dogs, where they're asking people questions, they're interviewing their comrades, all of that. Rich collection. Then the Senate came in and interviewed freedmen to ask them how they were being treated by the nation. So you may have an ancestor who was interviewed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So let's look at more documents. This is a list of Cherokee Blacks now residing in the vicinity of Osawatomie, which is Osawatomie, Kansas, who are desirous of returning to their homes and ask for government assistance. Remember, people fled into Kansas. So they're going to the Bureau of Indian Affairs and saying, please, can you help us get back to the Indian Territory? And you see, we find Jesse Van again. Now, mind you, y'all, Jesse Van died before he was like 45 or 50 years old. So the fact that I'm finding him in a number of documents, and again, he died before 1900, is incredible. Here, him, his wife, 5 children, 7 folks in their household, including him. He has 2 ponies. They're asking for the BIA to help them get back to the Indian Territory, okay, or back into the Cherokee Nation. And obviously they made it because they're on the 1867 Tompkins Roll. This is an example of a Senate subcommittee hearing meeting. This is the testimony of good old Ike Rogers that I've been talking about the whole time. You see, they're asking questions. What's your name? My name is Isaac Rogers. Where do you reside? I'm a resident of the Cherokee Nation. How long have you lived in the Cherokee Nation? I've lived in the Cherokee Nation for about 36 years. That was his whole life at that point, y'all. I don't know why he just didn't say all my life, but whatever. He gonna be contrary. Then they asked him if he's a freedman. He says yes. Will you tell us how the freedmen have been treated by the Cherokee Nation? We want all the information you can give us upon that subject. We have been recognized under the treaty as citizens only in part, but not in full, according to the terms of the treaty. That is, we have been allowed to live in the country and we have been allowed to vote, but in such things as enjoying the full privileges of the schools we have not been treated as the other people in the nation. There are a great many colored people who came here before the treaty was made and who were here at the making of the treaty can produce evidence that they came in the time limit. He's basically laying all the stuff out because they're asking him questions. This is like, we just had that hearing on UFOs. I know y'all paid attention to that, and the folks got up there talking. This is the exact same thing, only it is documented in print. Civil War records. This is Ike Rogers again. He was a part of the 1st Kansas. He was in Company E. And note on his service card, that's the descriptive card that tells you the age of the person, their height, their complexion, eye color, hair color, where they were born, their occupation, when they were mustered in, where, and when they were mustered out. All of that is on that service card. And note, it says he was born in the Cherokee Nation. Ike Rogers later went on to apply for a pension in the for his Civil War service. And this is an affidavit from the last Sarah that I was telling you about, the one from the 1890 Cherokee census. She says, "My name is Sarah Rogers. I'm the widow of Isaac Rogers, deceased late private in Company E, 79th Regiment, U.S. Colored Volunteer Infantry, that we were married on the 16th day of November, 1885 at my father's house, Andy Fry, on Grand River in the Cherokee Nation." There's a question in the chat. Are there some surnames that are common among freedmen or people should look for, or does it vary? Yes, absolutely. Rogers and Van are probably the top 2, along with Musgrove, Ryder, Bean. It really all depends on which district your folks lived in, because there's certain surnames, and typically in the Cherokee Nation, we do, like, outside of the nation, my ancestors didn't always take the name of the last slaveholder that they had, like the last person in emancipation. They didn't always take that name. In the Cherokee Nation, that is much more common, that the people kept the surnames of the slaveholding families. So when you see a Rogers, they're enslaved by a Rogers. If you see a Van, they were enslaved by a Van. So yes, there are some patterns on surnames in the Cherokee Nation. All right, so y'all, we done went through Cherokee records, federal records. Now we're going to talk about state records. Anything from vital records, state censuses, newspapers, the Pioneer Papers, and more. If you wanted to know what Cooey looked like, you're looking at a photo of Cooey. That's him with a bucket of apples. Believe it or not, he passed away by the time my grandmother was 4 years old. So she really did not know her father. And then her mother died by the time she was 17. So the fact that we even have pictures of these folks is incredible. Leslie and Tracy recognize one of the people in this picture. All right, so just like outside of the nation, right? You got to pivot, right? So then you're going to look at federal and local. You're looking at federal. We looked at Cherokee Nation. You're also going to look at state records. So you're talking vitals, right? Birth, marriage, and death. Those exist. Wills and probates and deed records. Same as outside of the nation. If your folks went into Kansas, Kansas had a state census. So they had federal and they had state. Instead of it being like 1870, 1880 in Kansas, it was 1865, 1875. Remember, I talked about Kansas City, Kansas. Did you all know that Kansas City, Kansas had a city census? They did it yearly. So if your folks went to Kansas City, or if they went into Kansas, you got a state census. If they went to Kansas City, you got a city census. And then you also have the federal census. And then you have the censuses for when they were in the nation. You have 4 different types of censuses you could look for. Now, all of the rest of these records, oh my gosh, we could sit here all day and talk about them. But the Oklahoma Pioneer Papers, these, if you've ever heard of the slave narratives, we have our own version of that in the Indian Territory. So that means that Works Progress Administration, just like they sent writers out throughout the United States for you to go and for them to interview people who were formerly enslaved, they did the same thing in Oklahoma with Freedmen. So those are available. They're typed up. You can search those online. There are a ton of newspapers in the Indian Territory and Kansas and Missouri. So if you have access to newspapers.com, search. They covered Freedmen. They covered news of Black folks. You saw, I showed you to lead off this presentation, talking about Emancipation Day. I pulled that right out of newspapers.com. So if you're having trouble finding folks, you're not sure, check the newspaper because we have great newspapers. Moravian Spring Place Mission, that was a religious outfit that came to the Cherokee Nation east. They settled on Joe Vann's plantation at Spring Hill, and they created a mission to basically convert Cherokees into Christianity. And they were German missionaries. These diaries were in this archaic form of German, but a college professor translated them and put them into 2 volumes. And they are writing almost every day in those journals, and they talk about the slaves. If there is a challenging aspect of researching in the Cherokee Nation, it's not finding out who the slaveholder is, because we can find that out easy with the Dawes card. It's not tracing between 1881 and 1899. No, we've got a bunch of rolls. It's not wanting to hear the voice of your ancestor. No, we have that. It's not having documents where they tell you the names of the ancestors. The hardest part is researching during the slavery era, because we didn't have deed books like we have them outside, where they're recording transactions and it's consistent. So yes, you'll get a name, but unless the slaveholding family left a bunch of documents, or you have things like these diaries, you're not going to get that day to day about that time period. Not like that. The American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Missions is another outfit that's similar to the Moravian Spring Place Mission, where it is Christians going in to evangelize with the Cherokee Nation. And this is not just the Cherokee Nation. They did this with all the 5 tribes. Harvard University has those papers. They're not indexed, but they're starting to digitize them and put them online. Now, in terms of newspapers, here's an example. This is a cousin of mine named Luther Martin. I had lost him. I didn't know where he went. He got rejected by the Dawes Commission. I tracked him to Nebraska on a marriage license, knew it was him, looked in Nebraska for him, couldn't find him. And then I broadened my search out, and I discovered he ended up in Buffalo, New York. And the reason why he was in Buffalo, New York was because he was a Pullman porter. He worked for the railroad. That's how he got to Nebraska. So when I looked at the newspaper, I discovered a profile on cousin Luther, talking about him going to night school to get his high school diploma. And it clearly outlined the fact that he got a year of school at the Cherokee Mission. It talked about that. Then it talked about who he was connected to within the nation as well. Now, this is text from those Spring Place Mission records. I just want to give you a heads up. Excuse me, this one, yeah, just want to give you a heads up a little bit. So it says, in the morning on the Sunday, the 13th was the church litany, and in the afternoon was our Bible reading, which, because of necessary work, had not been held on Wednesday. In the latter meeting, Mrs. Van, Negro girl Nan, was also present. The evening of young Dick's father came. Early in the day, on the Sunday the 27th, the young bird set off on his trip home. Brother and Sister Gambold visited Mrs. Van and asked them to take back home the Negro girl Nan, whom they had lent us several years ago to help with the small children. Some time ago, we became aware of a very bad and harmful things in her behavior toward the children. You see, they don't tell us what they were. She got worse rather than better in these things, despite our gentle and harsh warnings. We were afraid of the worst consequences for the children. Notice they weren't afraid of the worst consequences for her. They were afraid of the consequences for the children who have been entrusted to us. Mrs. Van had her fetched home soon thereafter, and on her arrival gave her a large number of lashes along with a strong reprimand. I share this information because there's this perception that slavery in the Indian nations was different, that it was better, it was more favorable, that they didn't beat their enslaved people, that they didn't have slave codes. That's not true. There were slave codes. In the Cherokee Nation, it was illegal for an enslaved person to disrupt a church service. And if you did, you got beat with a whip. There was a slave revolt in the Cherokee Nation. So explain to me, if that's the case, why do people believe that it was different? Because it wasn't. Right, poor little Nan. Based on my research, Nan would be a 5th or 6th great grandmother to me. And she has several children at this point. I still don't know what happened. Have no idea. We may never know. All right, a few more slides. You also have resources within Oklahoma. Okay, I haven't even talked about that stuff. Gilcrease Museum is currently closed for renovation in Tulsa, but they have a robust online presence and repository of original documents relating to the Cherokee Nation. You also have the Cherokee Family Research Center, so you can connect with them. Those are paid genealogists who are on staff from the Cherokee Nation. They can help you track down whether or not your ancestor was actually on the Dawes roll or if it was someone else. And they have a ton of books and other resources that are available there. That's in Tahlequah. Also, the Tennessee State Library and Archives, or that's the Tennessee State Archives. There are some records for the 5 tribes there in addition to other resources just for the state, but they do have some records for the Cherokee Nation. And then, of course, the Oklahoma Historical Society, which is in Oklahoma City. They are the official custodian of the tribal records, like the court records, marriages, stuff like that, on behalf of the National Archives. The National Archives has a branch in Fort Worth, and that's the geographical area. That's where the records for Oklahoma go. So if you want to go see original Dawes cards and stuff like that, you can go to the National Archives branch in Dallas, Fort Worth. All right. And right before questions, this is the last record that I'm going to show you guys today. This is from the Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa, their digital collection. You can download this. There's no cost to it. Know All by These Men presents that Susanna Cootie of the Cherokee Nation for in consideration of the sum of $400 to me in hand by John Ross of the Nation. And John Ross was the chief of the Cherokee Nation. Aforesaid have this day bargained, sold, and delivered one certain Negro boy slave for life named Peter, aged about 18. These bills of sale, again, they're not typical. There is no voluminous collection of these, but when you find them like this, it's great. All right, questions?
What did you say?